Hello, everyone. My name is Father Thomas. It's great to be with you today, and I'm happy to share with you a little bit about the Holy Father's third encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. Fratelli Tutti is an encyclical on fraternity and social friendship, and it's a long encyclical, and it has a lot of content in it, so I'll do the best I can to cover most of the points. Some of this is going to be a little detailed, I know, and certainly in some parts I'm going to be skipping ahead. So let's begin here by noting that this document was written not exclusively or even primarily for Christians. It's written to all people of goodwill. So maybe one way to think of it is, imagine if you had a lot of conflicts and issues and problems in your neighborhood, and you think to yourself, as a Christian, I should get out there. I should try to make a difference or bring people together, foster greater love and harmony. That's kind of like what the Holy Father is doing here with this document, except in a global context. He's speaking to all the people of goodwill around the world and trying to bring them together in love and harmony, but he's doing it because he's a Christian and because he's the Pope. He cites several sources of inspiration here, and primarily it's based on the Abu Dhabi Agreement, what's colloquially called the Abu Dhabi Agreement. And it was a meeting that he had with the Grand Imam Ahmad al-Tayeb, where they produced a document kind of focusing on how we could mutually respect each other and live in peace and kind of coexistence or harmony. He has other influences as well. The purpose of the document is to give a teaching on universal fraternal love. Okay, so it's trying to explain what that means. What does it mean for us to have a love that extends beyond all boundaries and borders to embrace everyone? Okay, and it's going to be focusing on that throughout this document. Okay, so I've broken down my presentation here into these 6 sections, and it's not strictly following the structure of the document itself, but this is the way I've sort of broken it down. To begin with, and this is right at the beginning of the encyclical, if you're looking at the encyclical or if you plan to, this is in chapter 1. It's called The Dark Clouds Over Our World, over a Closed World. And it lists out these different problems which prevent us from advancing towards universal fraternity. We'll quickly go through them. So one is a growing trend of nationalism. After the world wars, kind of the nations of the world realized that if we keep going like this, we're all going to destroy each other. We practically did, or almost did. And so we need to build solidarity amongst ourselves, find ways in which we can work together. The Holy Father sees that that is sort of breaking down, and we're going towards nationalism again, which can lead to war. He sees globalism, and these kind of next 2 points are where we see a kind of a single cultural model, which is being imposed over a lot of places, especially over weaker places. And it's sort of overriding kind of rich cultural traditions and heritages are being just overridden by this single cultural model. There's no healthy political life. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. There's a hyperbole, extremism, polarization. We're just basically shouting at each other. It's a shouting match, rather than a healthy political process. There's a throwaway culture, insufficiently universal human rights. We have a double standard when it comes to affronts to human dignity. It depends on who's affected and how much they're related to us or our interests. We're building walls to protect our dignity and rights, but then to treat the others as though they're not human beings. The people on the other side of our boundaries or borders, we don't really consider them as human beings often. We're making advancements in technology and but not so much in human values, in dignity, and so we see a less humane future on the horizon. There's xenophobia, racism. Um, there's a loss of right to privacy because in the digital world, we bring everything into the open, and we feel like it's okay to just be peering through somebody's personal and private life, right? Um, we see an increase in social aggression, which is it's a kind of a very astute observation from the Pope. We're in kind of protective isolation. I'm here behind my computer on social media. I don't have to. I could say whatever I want, and so it becomes this weird outlet for my social aggression, and it kind of festers and grows there without healthy human dialogue and interaction um, alongside it. So let's begin here with the Holy Father's teaching on universal love, universal fraternity. There's an anthropological basis for universal love, which means that as a human being, I have to go outside myself in order to be a human being. It's just the very way in which I'm made. This was a teaching of the Second Vatican Council as well, where it said that man discovers himself through the sincere gift of himself. I can't really discover who I am or even fully be human or who I am unless I go outside of myself. Well, the same thing applies to our families, to our communities, to our countries, everywhere. In order for us to truly be human, we always have to have this attitude of reaching outside of ourselves to the other. Otherwise, even if it's, for example, as a family, I might say, well, I'm not selfish. I care about my family. But you could be a selfish family. As a family too, you must discover the call to go outside of ourselves, to reach outside of ourselves. He uses the Good Samaritan as a sort of foundational image, parable for us to reflect on when it comes to universal fraternity and love. I call it the allegory because he draws out a lot of different beautiful interpretations or interpolations, I guess, of the passage. One thing he says is that when we think of the people who just pass by, the passers-by, um, it can remind us, or it causes us to reflect on our own attitude towards the suffering in our world. It tells us that there's no room for an appeal to determinism or fatalism as justification for our own indifference. Meaning what? I see suffering, I see a suffering person, and I basically tell myself, there's always going to be suffering in the world. There's always going to be poverty in the world. We can't fix it. That's what he calls fatalism, right? Oh, there's nothing we can do. And so I justify my lack of involvement, my lack of response to this pressing human need by saying that, well, nothing can change. The other problem is we simply just don't have time. We are so busy and engaged in seeking prosperity, progress, that we don't have time for another person's sufferings. It's kind of contradictory. We're working towards progress, but we don't have time for the suffering. So at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, are we the Good Samaritan, or are we the indifferent bystander or the passerby? We have to ask ourselves that question every day personally. Who am I? I have millions of reasons for why I don't have time, for why I'm passing by. But at the end of the day, am I the Good Samaritan, or am I the indifferent person? This is also the judgment, like a criterion for evaluating, the Holy Father says, all of our institutions, our policies, our projects. So that would include our parishes. We have to use this as the criterion to evaluate, are we today, are we being the Good Samaritan, or are we being the indifferent passerby? A powerful examination of conscience, I guess you could say. It's not coincidental that in the parable that Jesus gives us, that the passersby were religious figures. We have to be careful of a false religiosity. And this is a great test of false religiosity, where we have all these bells and whistles and all of that, but we're not fundamentally oriented towards the suffering, the poor, and the marginalized. Look at this beautiful quote from the church father, St. John Chrysostom. Do you wish to honor the body of the Savior? Do not despise it, as we say, when it is naked. Do not honor it in church with silk vestments, while outside it is naked and numb with cold. So he's saying, how can you honor the body of our Lord in the Eucharist with all these silk vestments, but then when it's outside the body of our Lord in the poor person, we simply neglect it? It's contradictory. So, but primarily in the passage, what we see is, keep in mind that the Jews and the Samaritans were, they didn't mix at all. To a Jewish person, a Samaritan was just impure, literally, impure for them, and detestable and even dangerous. But all of these boundaries are broken here through the Good Samaritan who reaches out to this broken person, this wounded person. So Pope Francis says this encounter of mercy is highly provocative. It teaches us this universal dimension of our call to love, one that transcends all prejudices, all historical and cultural barriers, all petty interests. The question for us, brothers and sisters, as we reflect on Fratelli Tutti, I think the real question for us is, what is the primary lens through which we look at another person? Whoever it is, whether it is our coworker, somebody at school, or whether it's the person on the street, the homeless person, the drug addict, or whoever it is, what is the primary lens? Whether it's a person from another country, another culture, another race, another color, can we honestly say that the primary lens by which I look at this person is, I see them as being in the image and likeness of God, a human being with all the dignity and richness of being God's image and likeness? Or do I primarily see that maybe, but I primarily see them as something else, some other category? That's where we would have to evaluate and examine our own consciences in the light of this teaching on universal fraternal love. Central to the Holy Father's teaching is this whole idea of encounter, creative tensions, and dialogue. Okay, so the Holy Father is not talking about a universal love that's just like, oh yeah, everything is fine. We're all, we're all in peace and harmony. Everything is great. It's not like that. It's a much more dynamic process. And we're going to look into what that process looks like here. But first, I want to read this beautiful quote. Indeed, the media's noisy potpourri of facts and opinions is often an obstacle to dialogue, since it lets everyone cling stubbornly to his or her own ideas, interests, and choices with the excuse that everyone else is wrong. It becomes easier to discredit and insult opponents from the outset rather than open a respectful dialogue aimed at achieving agreement on a deeper level. Now, this last sentence is certainly worth our reflection. Worse, this kind of language, usually drawn from media coverage of political campaigns, has become so widespread so as to be part of daily conversation. In other words, rather than having genuine dialogue and conversation, this way of very hostile and degrading way of communication, we've sort of taken from the media, and now it's become, unfortunately, it's affected the way we interact with each other. You can certainly see this play out sometimes, even in our parishes, which is sad because we're Christian communities, but we're learning how to interact with each other from media. So what does this process look like? First of all, we should see ourselves with the other party, whoever they are, as an us rather than an us and a them. Okay, so there's this negative role of fear and insulating myself from we need to protect ourselves from them. They're the bad people, we're afraid of them. We have to kind of grow up and mature out of that to be able to say that fundamentally we're two people, or we're two groups of people, whatever it may be, genuinely striving to find the common good. Maybe we'll get to that next point here, but when I recognize that another person has the right to be themselves and their right to their own opinion, even if they disagree with me, even if I'm totally on the opposite side of this matter, still they have the right to be themselves. They have the right to express their opinions. Okay, so fundamentally, that it's not an us and them, that we're an us. Secondly, we need to foster welcome and listen. Listening is something that's really lost for us today in our society. We have taken on this frenzy of the modern world where we don't have time to listen to each other. If another person starts speaking and they're speaking something that I disagree with, I can't even listen. I have to interrupt and say, no, not like that. The Holy Father talks about this in the document. Why can't we just take the time to listen, to sit down with another person? If it's passionate, fine, or if it's calm, fine, but just listening to the other person and genuinely trying to understand what they're saying and where they're coming from. Part of the problem, when you look at the way that social media is structured, is if somebody's posting something that I disagree with, whether it's on Twitter or Instagram, I'm not familiar with the way all of them work, but generally you can unfriend somebody that you don't agree with. Well, look at what this person's posting. I cannot believe it. I'm going to unfriend them. I'm going to block them. Now that's very artificial in the sense that if you're in a neighborhood, if you belong to let's say you lived in a traditional village, you can't just unfriend somebody. You can't just block them or delete them, and now all of a sudden you won't hear anything they say or see any of their perspectives or thoughts. You have to learn how to work with each other, how to listen to each other. So there's that artificial bubble that we've created through social media has also caused us to lose our abilities to welcome and to listen to another person, another human being. Particularly important is that we're always hearing the voice of the vulnerable and the marginalized in all of our discussions and conversations. Next, we get into dialogue. Dialogue is different than a shouting match. It's different than two parallel monologues. It comes from a fundamental commitment to the common good. What does that mean? If I'm trying to enter into a dialogue with you, okay, maybe we both come from two very different backgrounds, we have very different viewpoints. When we're trying to have a dialogue, we're both committed to finding the truth. We're both committed to arriving at a deeper truth or a higher truth, a common good. It's not my selfish interest. I'm not trying to just win or conquer you. So that commitment to the common good is the foundation by which we can have a dialogue, and it gives us the the perseverance to work through, even passionate conversation or debate, or maybe relaxed conversation. It could be either one, but fundamentally we're committed. We're going to arrive at the higher truth, at the common good. It needs patience, and that's something, again, which we may have lost a little bit in our modern world with its digital speed. What's the point of dialogue? Now, I know that a lot of times all of us will think, oh, what's the point of dialogue? You know, um, part of this whole document is believing again in dialogue. The dialogue can really work if we're humble enough to listen to each other, and at the same time to express ourselves genuinely. Ultimately, what we can do is arrive at a consensus. Consensus is not just where, okay, you think this, I think that, let's maybe just compromise, or let's just maybe, or what the majority of people think, we'll just go with that. That's not what he means by consensus. In a pluralistic society, okay, what does that mean? A pluralistic society, there is no single viewpoint that is considered, this is the authoritative source. This is everyone is entitled to their viewpoints. In a pluralistic society, the only way we can arrive at the universal and objective moral truth is through dialogue, by challenging each other's viewpoints, raising up valid points and reasoning and working through disagreements, that hopefully we can work towards finding the truth, which is universal and objective. It's not a relative truth, it's really universal and objective, but we can only arrive at it through this process of dialogue. If there's a belief in us that, oh, consensus can never arrive at objective truth, that's something that the Holy Father asks us to look deeper into. Why can't there be? Why shouldn't there be a harmony between consensus and objective truth? As human beings, God has given us the ability to dialogue, perhaps precisely so that we can arrive at objective truth together as a society. Now, in this process, you're going to come into conflict, and that's okay. We shouldn't seek out conflict just for the sake of conflict, but neither should we try to avoid it. We should be willing to endure it when it comes. Pope Francis talks about how Jesus says, I have not come to bring peace, but the sword. If you're a person who stands for the truth, who stands for your principles, you should probably anticipate some kind of conflict that's going to come up. But conflict is not something to be afraid of if we are willing to resolve it through genuine dialogue, open, honest, patient conversation. Can actually allow us both. See, when there's a conflict between me and someone else, and we're both open to try to engage in dialogue, we can together arrive at the truth, rather than me just putting down the other person and just going off on my own into my own isolation. We can work together to arrive at the truth. Ultimately, you can say that what the Holy Father envisions is dialogic realism, which means it's not just tolerance, certainly not just tolerance, where it's like, okay, we'll just tolerate each other's viewpoints. It's believing again in the possibility of conversation, where each person remains faithful to their own principles. Each person is genuine in expressing their principles, but also allowing the other person to speak, listening to the other person and where they're coming from. And ultimately, this is only possible by love. Universal, fraternal love will enable us to arrive at dialogic realism. So, excuse me here. Now we get to the Holy Father's views on politics and economics. Essentially, what the Holy Father is saying if you want to understand his political viewpoints and his economic viewpoints, it's, take a look at this paragraph. It really challenged me. It really caused me to think. So it says some people are born into economically stable families. They have a fine education, they're well nourished, they possess great talent naturally. Well, in that case, they're not going to need a proactive state. They just need to claim their freedom, right? So if you think about us, right? I mean, we have to be honest with ourselves. We live in one of the wealthiest, most powerful, and successful countries in the world. Our daily lives are very different than the daily lives of the majority of people on this planet. So for us, when we think of what's the role of government, we want a government that's going to enable us to be free, not come in the way of our exercising our freedom. But when we think about other people, see, look what he says here. Yet the same rule clearly does not apply to a disabled person, to someone born in dire poverty, to those lacking a good education and with little access to adequate health care. If society is governed primarily by the criteria of market freedom and efficiency, there is no place for such persons, and fraternity will remain just another vague ideal. So we have to keep in mind, as I said, that there are so many people, of course, including in our country, who are not born into great situations. And for them, just the fact that, okay, the government's not going to interfere in your life is not particularly helpful. Imagine if I'm trying to imagine, okay, if I was born in poverty, if I grew up without an education, if I grew up without good health, if I was disabled, try to put yourselves in such a person's shoes. What do they need in order to survive? That those thoughts should help shape our political and economic policies as well. Whenever you look at any of the church's social doctrines, the social teachings of the church, there are two principles at play, which we certainly can't go into here. But just at a very high level, solidarity and subsidiarity. Solidarity means that we need to work together as different localities, as different nations, whatever it is, we need to work together and organize together. But subsidiarity protects the opposite dimension, which is that, well, if something can be done by a family, then it ought to be done by the family. If something can be done by a city or a town, then the country shouldn't go and do it instead. So it kind of protects the rights of the smaller units to do things that are within their competence. So both of these are emphasized by the church, and they have to be they have to work together. In this document, the Holy Father is emphasizing solidarity. That's very clear. He's primarily focusing on the need for greater solidarity, working together. So as I said, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit on some portions, especially in this section here. When it comes to migration, the Holy Father says that we shouldn't have this attitude of being afraid of migrants, afraid of people from other cultures. And instead, we should have an attitude of welcoming immigrants, protecting them, promoting them, and integrating them. And so what does that journey look like? It has to be worked out. Ultimately, when somebody becomes a citizen, by the time they become a citizen, he says they should have full citizenship, which means that they shouldn't then be looked at as a minority or, still as somebody who's not fully. So for example, here in America, well, all of us are, in a sense, immigrants. At least many of us are immigrants. And after becoming citizens, you shouldn't still feel like you're a second-class citizen or that you don't truly belong to this country. That should be resolved, or that problem should be eliminated. it's worrisome that when it comes to immigration, that he says some countries only accept scientists or investors, professionals. Behind that, there is this kind of simplistic belief that the poor are dangerous and useless, while the powerful are generous benefactors. That's obviously a simplistic belief and not true. Does a person, merely because he's poor, have nothing to contribute? Whereas a person who's rich has something to contribute and is going to contribute to the genuine good of that country? That's a simplistic belief. Certainly something for us to think about. He proposes on many levels, different levels of global governance, and one of them is with immigration, because immigration always has global impacts. He talks about the positive value. Now, one thing I should point out is ultimately the Holy Father doesn't think that, or he kind of wishes for a world in which migration wasn't really necessary. Like a person should be able to stay in their home, in their home country and their home land, in their relationships and family connections, culture that that they've had maybe for generations. At the same time, though, if a person in their home country and home place is not able to survive, is looking for greater opportunities, they should be free to do so. And there are many positive benefits to migration as well. And one of them, if he gives, for example, is how the East and the West can be mutually enriching, where their cultures can be mutually enriching. The West can receive from the spiritual and the more spiritual orientation of the Eastern cultures against our tendency towards materialism. And, the East can find from the West help with scientific, technical advancement, and so on. One really interesting teaching that the Holy Father gives here, and he's given before, is about politics. Politics is not something bad. That's basically what he's saying. In fact, he's saying the opposite. Politics is a lofty vocation, one of the highest forms of charity, inasmuch as it seeks the common good. Unfortunately, we don't. We have a very negative view of politics, and the Holy Father wants to rectify that. For example, let's say there is an elderly person, trying to cross a river, he says, and you go and you lift up that elderly person to take them across. That's an act of charity. Well, a politician is the person who says, we need to build a bridge there so that all these elderly persons are able to cross safely. Well, that too is an act of charity. Politicians are these doers and builders. They're these leaders who exercise charity really in their action, in their dreaming, in their building out society. That's what it should be. I mean, he certainly warns against the evils of politics, which come from when when a person is just trying to get, win public favor, just basically win votes by whatever means necessary. Or they're trying to gain favor by appealing to people's lower nature, like by appealing to their greed or selfishness or racism and so on. But ultimately, he's really against a totally anti-political view that says, oh, politics is useless. We can't really, politicians are always going to be corrupt and selfish. Instead, we should just focus on the economy, amassing greater and greater wealth. Economy should be subject or subordinated to the overall political process, which thinks about how we as a society can foster greater human values. Economy is part of that, but it should not be, the economy should not be the ultimate ruling force. Now we get to war and capital punishment, because these are two areas where it seems that the Holy Father is giving a new teaching. And so it's good for us to understand what he's saying. First of all, when it comes to capital punishment, That's really not, that perhaps didn't create as many waves because it's already been in progress from the previous popes. Pope John Paul II said that it's no longer necessary. And essentially that's where the teaching, so the classical teaching about capital punishment is that it's, it could be acceptable in a situation where there's an aggressor who's some unjust person or corrupt person or, terrible person who's so bad that there's no way for us as a society to stop them. No matter what you do, they're still going to perpetrate crimes. The only option is we need to kill them. So that's kind of where the traditional belief or the traditional teaching about capital punishment being okay comes from. And essentially what the popes have said is, there's no situation like that in our modern world. Really, there's no one today that we can't stop by through through putting them in jail, incarcerating them, and so on. So that's not really a relevant thing today. What the church certainly doesn't believe in is using capital punishment as a way of exacting vengeance on a person. They've done so many horrible things that they deserve to die. We should kill them in vengeance. That's never been part of the church's teaching. Now, when it comes to just war, this is a lot more of a significant thing. He says it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. Never again war. So he's saying in the past, people have said there was some rational criteria by which you could have a just war, a war that's morally acceptable. But Pope Francis is saying, no more war. This is his, well, first, let's look at the rational criteria that was elaborated in earlier centuries. This is from St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, and it's based on the teachings of St. Augustine. He says there's 3 criteria that allow for a war to be morally acceptable. First, the war is called for by the person who has the legitimate power or authority to do so. Secondly, there has to be a good cause for going into war, or a just cause. What made this war necessary? Was there some crime done by the other country? Was there something taken, wrongfully, and so on. The third criteria is that the intention of going into war, the intended outcome is good, or is at least to avoid evil. It's not just out of vengeance, or just since they did this horrible thing to us, let's just go and, destroy them or take them over now or whatever. The intention has to be for the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil. Okay, so those were the traditional criteria. Now, what's the argument against just war that we see from Pope Francis? I would say the primary argument that he makes is based on new technology that we see being used in war. When we think of a war today, what do we think of? Bombs, missiles, atomic radiation, biochemical effects, warfare. So compare that to the 13th century when Thomas Aquinas is writing. A war back then was bows and arrows and swords and spears or whatever else. I mean, essentially it was, of course it was cruel, but it was between the soldiers. I mean, the two forces of both countries were going at it with each other. But today there's a lot of collateral damage. I mean, think about an atomic bomb. Think about biochemical warfare and so on. The effects are tremendous, or even just with a bomb. It affects so many civilians and innocent people who have really nothing to do with this conflict often, who are just trying to live their lives. They're killed, they're severely injured and harmed. And of course, the planet is also severely harmed, which affects future generations. So essentially, the Holy Father is saying, there's such dramatic and horrible consequences to war now. how can we justify it? Okay, so I think this next quote here from the Holy Father really kind of captures where he's coming from. Let us not remain mired in theoretical discussions, but touch the wounded flesh of the victims. Let us look once more at all those civilians whose killing was considered collateral damage. Let us ask the victims themselves. Do you remember, this is such an important aspect for the Holy Father in dialogue, that we have to listen to the others, especially to those who are weak and vulnerable and marginalized. We have to hear their voice. So he says, let us ask the victims themselves. Let us think of the refugees and displaced, those who suffered the effects of atomic radiation or chemical attacks, the mothers who lost their children, and the boys and girls maimed or deprived of their childhood. Let us hear the true stories of these victims of violence, look at reality through their eyes, and listen with an open heart to the stories they tell. In this way, we will be able to grasp the abyss of evil at the heart of war. Nor will it trouble us to be deemed naive for choosing peace. Okay, so what is he saying? He's saying, you might call me naive for saying I'm against war and saying that I stand for peace, but I have heard the stories. I have interacted with these people who have truly been affected by war, by the mothers who have lost their children, and so on. And if you hear from them, if you listen to them, then you won't call me, or at least it's not going to bother me that you call me naive, because their reality is just so horrific that I can't even imagine that there could be any just cause for war anymore. Okay, so that's kind of where he's coming from. It's to say that war in our modern world with modern technology is just too atrocious. It should never be allowed. It should never happen again. Okay. Lastly, he talks about the contributions of religions in universal fraternity. Okay, and also in this process of dialogue that we talked about. There's a quote that comes in here, a kind of shout out to the CBCI, the Bishops of India. But essentially what he's saying is this: religion, whatever religion in the world, plays an important role. It can't just be pushed off to the side and now we only listen to experts and scientists and politicians or economists. No, religion draws from transcendent truths, timeless truths, the wisdom of centuries, universal values, and it tries to present them to the present day society. So their voice, the voice of religion, needs to be heard in the public sphere, in political debate. The voice of religious leaders or of the religions is important to hear. That's what's going to prevent us from getting swept away by selfish interests and just other narrow-minded thinking. We're here at the end of our presentation, and the Holy Father ends this encyclical with two prayers, because it's written, again, not just to Christians, but to all people of goodwill. He gives two prayers. One is a kind of generic prayer, and the other one is a Christian prayer. And so we'll close here with this Christian prayer. O God, Trinity of love from the profound communion of your divine life, pour out upon us a torrent of fraternal love. Grant us the love reflected in the actions of Jesus in his family of Nazareth and in the early Christian community. Grant that we Christians may live the gospel, discovering Christ in each human being, recognizing him crucified in the sufferings of the abandoned and forgotten of our world, and risen in each brother or sister who makes a new start. Come, Holy Spirit, show us your beauty, reflected in all the peoples of the earth, so that we may discover anew that all are important and all are necessary, different faces of the one humanity, that God so loves. Amen. Brothers and sisters, it's thank you for listening. I know that this was quite long and detailed, but the crux of it is this. As Christians, let's not lose our hope in humanity. That as human beings, with all of our imperfections, with all of the errors that we see in modern society even, that we can actually make progress together, that we can strive for universal values, human values, that if we engage in conversation, in dialogue with others, that together we can journey towards the fullness of truth, towards universal and fraternal love. Particularly in times where we see so much division, so much hostility, let's not become part of that. Especially as Christians, let's not become fuel that further, but let's instead try to build a society where it's possible to hear and listen to each other, even when we have opposing views, but that we can genuinely present our side, genuinely present our values, listening, but also speaking, engaging in dialogue, and building authentic universal fraternity. Well, I hope that was helpful for you. And of course, I encourage you to read the encyclical directly if you can. But if not, I hope this gives you a high-level picture of what it's about. It was great being with you all. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.